Thank you for joining Payments Ed and Verifi for this great topic this afternoon. I am going to turn this over to our speaker, Chris Marchand. Chris, we've known each other a long time, and it's really good to get to work with you again.
Thanks so much, Laura. Always great to work with you, and really just want to say thank you to you and Payments Ed for all that you do for the payments industry and the educational content that you guys consistently put out there to make the payments industry a better place, a safer place for all merchants, acquirers, issuers, etc. Very excited to be part of this webinar today and take everybody on this journey, or this beautiful friendship journey that we're going to explore. First and foremost, just a little bit about Verifi. We are a third-party solution. We've been around since 2005, and we primarily help merchants, issuers, acquirers address challenges as it relates to consumer disputes. About myself, for those of you I haven't been lucky enough to meet yet, my name is Chris Marchand. I co-manage all of business development for Verifi. I've been with Verifi about 7 years. Prior to Verifi, I was at a company called Chase Payment Tech for about 9 years. So my experience in the payments industry is a little more than 16 years. Today on this call, what we want to do is talk about the ability of all the different parties in the payments ecosystem. So you think merchants, issuers, acquirers, third parties, and how we can all work together and establish this beautiful friendship, as we have in the title, to really help all parties get better and strengthen this customer journey. So if we jump right in to understand how we're going to get there and get to our goal of this strengthened customer journey, we really need to know a little bit about where we came from and how we got here. So I'm not going to bore you with a huge history lesson, but I think when you think about consumer disputes and chargebacks, you really have to go all the way back to 1974 when the Consumer Credit Act was created, and it was really created so that the federal government had some type or established some type of consumer protections against fraud as they really increased revolving credit lines for consumers. And so that's really where kind of the concept of a chargeback comes into play. Obviously, we've come a long way since then. Technology continues to improve, solutions improve, and then there's easier and more convenient ways for the consumer to ultimately transact with a merchant. And all this means is that as you improve these solutions and technology, there's more potential ways for fraud and disputes to occur. So really, that's why we're on this webinar today. The payments ecosystem in itself, as time marches on and continues to evolve, it becomes really apparent that it's more dependent upon collaboration to improve all the experiences and become more secure for all parties. So I think one of the things we want to make sure we get out of today is that where it might have been easier to operate in silos in the past, this is something that is going to have to change going forward, where these parties have to work together to really make progress and strengthen the entire ecosystem. So if we jump into where card-present vulnerability existed. So up until the internet really came into play and became widely available, fraud, friendly or otherwise, existed primarily in a card-present environment. And so it migrated over the years. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with 2015 and when we had that EMV migration. That really took a lot of the counterfeit fraud out of the card-present space. And naturally, the point of least resistance was the card not present space, and we saw a migration there. I believe back in May, Visa actually announced that EMV was directly responsible for a 76% reduction in counterfeit fraud in the card present environments. As we look to some of the estimates, I have one up here by Forbes. The annual cost of fraud by 2020, so not too far away, is right now about 25.6 billion. I'm sure that number is going to go up by the time we finally get there in the next 5 or 6 months. So with card present seeing such a reduction in this fraud, the migration occurs to e-commerce in a number of different ways. So what we have in front of you here are really 4 of the most common ways that fraud-related problems pop up for merchants. And I think as a merchant, as you look to address these particular challenges as it relates to fraud, which ultimately become these consumer disputes, is how do you address this while maintaining the proper balance in your own environment and not turning away good sales? I think there's a lot of great solutions out there that a merchant can look to help reduce this fraud that occurs, especially in these particular venues you're seeing in the screen: card theft, account takeover, increased chargebacks, and then family and friendly fraud. The challenge is if you ratchet up those controls on the front end so tight that you drastically lower a lot of these occurrences of fraud, you're potentially losing a bunch of good sales. And so this level of balance is really going to be dependent upon each merchant and your own unique environment, your consumer demographic. There's no magic number to say this is exactly what you do for every merchant and you're going to be all set. The other thing is you really need to look at this as kind of a living organism. This isn't something that you can really deploy and put out there and say, all right, we've done it, let's move on. Let's look at our next initiative. We've taken care of fraud. As the industry evolves, and we showed in that previous slide, all the progress that's happened since 1974. With the technology available now, progress is moving at a faster pace. And so as a result, you're going to have to make sure that you're keeping up with all of this excellent technology that's making our lives easier, making it easier for us to transact and interact with our consumers. But on the flip side of the coin, it means that the evolution is occurring for fraud as well. So as we progress with all these great solutions, fraud is progressing just as rapidly. I think as you get into some of this and you look to how to address it, the visibility is really what you're going to need across your environment so that you understand what's happening at all points of interaction with your consumer. And you might have to devise different plans to address each interaction point and how you can reduce fraud and maintain that correct balance. So over time, and you look at that progress we went through, perceptions have changed. And perceptions have changed not just in one area, but with all parties in the payment space. And I think if you look at Verifi did a study with Javelin back in 2018, and that's where all these statistics are coming from. You're seeing this or hearing this type of feedback that merchants are looking for that greater cooperation with issuers. That was, 78%. That's an overwhelming majority saying, hey, we need this to occur to make sure that we can help reduce the consumer disputes or at least control the chargebacks. So I think these statistics that we have up here are very telling and really point to what the industry or what the market is looking for. The consumers have more choices than ever before when interacting, when purchasing. And so as that happens and they have the ability to purchase a similar or the same product from multiple sources, it starts to drill down to how each merchant can really deliver the most positive customer experience to keep those consumers coming to them. We're in a time right now with the technology and all of the great platforms that are out there that it's almost like immediate gratification. I think we all know we can go online and purchase something really quickly. And our experience in that quick time frame is going to determine a number of things in how we interact in the future and go back and work with these merchants or what type of future relationship we're going to have as a consumer. So these are all things merchants need to take into account. And as we do that and think about what makes up that relationship with our customer, we need to make sure that we're working with all the other parties in that collaborative effect to truly help deliver the right experience that we want that customer to have to foster the correct type of relationship and make that a long-term relationship with our consumer. So how we do that, and I guess what we'll focus on for this particular discussion, is really a convenient checkout process. So you've done all that work, your marketing teams have done all that great work, you've gotten the customer to your site, you have the product they want, you're going through this whole thing, and then you get to the checkout process. And so we're trying to meet these consumer expectations. We, being merchants, are trying to meet consumer expectations to deliver both a positive experience, have as little friction as possible, but provide security and ultimately reduce consumer disputes and fraud from hitting. And when you put all those together, that is a tough thing to achieve. As we talked about in a couple slides before, there's some great tools that you can use to authenticate the customer to really make sure you're doing business with a real consumer, a good consumer, so on and so forth. But the more you do, the more friction you put into your environment, which, based on a consumer expectation, this could cause challenges. We list some of the pros and cons right in front of you on a convenient checkout process. And, I think if you look at having less friction, having a good customer experience, you're going to see less cart abandonment. If you put too many controls in place and it's taking too long for the consumer to get her order, then you're going to get into a position where that cart abandonment might increase. And so that comes back to what we talked about from a balance perspective. How are you offering a convenient checkout process while still maintaining that you have the right controls in place to minimize a fraudulent impact on your organization? Keeping in mind all the while that the customer is going to remember this experience, and that's going to dictate or determine, do they come back? And so when you think about a convenient checkout process, there's a cost, or a cost to providing it, right? A cost on the front end and then a cost on the back end. And when we look at those costs and what they mean, they have a ripple effect. So this would be the convenience ripple effect as it relates to your organization. And so you have a lot of stakeholders in driving new business, acquiring new consumers, and then keeping those customers. So if we look at the customer journey as a whole, you can see these organizations or divisions inside your organizations are going to be directly impacted by decisions you're going to make as it relates to the checkout process. And so as we get to the topic of customer loyalty, how do you create that? The marketing team has done quite a good job getting that customer to you. The accounting team, if we see more chargebacks, that's going to be mounting fees and work for them from a reconcile perspective. The operations team, obviously more orders that they're shipping out the door, this is going to increase their workload, so on and so forth. Customer support, if during your checkout process there's certain pieces of information that aren't shared with the consumer, or we don't have the right follow-up processes, the customer support may be inundated with phone calls, which creates longer call times, which means there's other consumers that you can't get to, which could mean to an unhappy consumer, which leads to a bad experience, which might lead to no repeat business. So there's a lot to think about as you put in these different controls and ultimately create and craft your own unique consumer journey. I think the most obvious would be the revenue and growth, right? And the impacts that those will have on the type of experience that you're providing. So if we look at, ideas around how to create this positive customer experience and things that are really important to us, it's really around balancing convenience, limiting the amount of friction, and then we want to make sure we're minimizing fraud and disputes. And so as I talked about earlier, the level of balance is going to differ for each merchant, right? Some merchants, depending on goods and services, if you are a tangible good versus an intangible good, you may have different risk thresholds on what you deem acceptable from a fraud or a chargeback, perspective. Keeping in mind that fraud and chargebacks are always going to be there. You're never going to eliminate them 100%. I'm not trying to say that these are going to be a cost of doing business, and I know some merchants look at it that way, but understanding that this is part of the ability to accept payments in a card not present environment is the fact that there will be some level of fraud and chargebacks. And it's what you can do to minimize that, I think, that really sets you apart and keeps your merchant account in good standing, keeps your risk thresholds in a positive area. Things to consider from that perspective. So fraud tools, these are something you definitely want to consider. Buyer profiles. Absolutely. You're developing a relationship with your customer. You're building on this. There's a lot of information that you can leverage in these buyer profiles, understanding the consumer, their wants, how you as an organization need to potentially pivot, or things you're going to need to do going forward to continue to evolve to meet the consumer's expectations and demands. Personalization. I think everyone loves it when they understand, hey, this merchant has an idea of who I am and things that are important to me. The payment options, there's many out there. I think it's important to understand through those buyer profiles how your customers want to pay, how they want to interact with you and transact. This is all part of that positive customer experience. So as you're building the foundation of your checkout process, of your consumer checkout process, these are things to consider. Loyalty programs and incentives. I know I'm not telling you a lot of things you don't already know. This is just more putting it in perspective and potential implications if you include these or potentially leave them out, some of the things you may or may not get during your checkout process. And then keeping in mind, this is going to be fluid, right? So this isn't something that you're just going to operate in a set it and forget it type of environment or atmosphere. This is something that's going to have to continue to evolve as new payment methods come out there, as new programs or loyalty programs or incentives hit the market. These are things you're going to have to consider. I think communication is a big thing, and I think that's, I think I mentioned it at the start of this webinar. That's the thing that Payments Ed really fosters, is that communication between merchants and getting away from that kind of siloed approach, because odds are if you're getting hit by, an inordinate amount of fraud on the front end, other merchants in your particular vertical in the same type of industry as you are probably getting hit by the same thing. And as one merchant figures out how to address those challenges and what works for them, that communication really becomes vital, sharing that knowledge so that others can do so as well. So that's something to keep in mind. I know it's a little bit of a tangent off from the customer experience, but the communication and that knowledge share can definitely help you positively impact your consumer checkout process, your customer experience process that you're trying to design. But the end thing is you got to keep this thing changing. It has to evolve with the technology and with the marketplace. So if we think about now, we're at the checkout process. I know speed is important. And for a while, that's what we heard, right? How do we get frictionless checkout? How do we get this as fast as possible and get the consumer, wrapped up their order, satisfied, and out the door? I think over time and more recently, as customers are really valuing that experience with a merchant, and that really dictates repeat purchases, visibility, transparency, and safety are becoming much more important than necessarily speed by itself. Consumers want to understand that the merchants that they're doing business with, their data is safe. There's so many things that we hear about in the payment space or even outside, where just organizations are having data being exposed. This is something that's on consumers' minds. And so as you provide those processes in the checkout experience and the consumer does feel safe, I think a little bit of friction is probably a good thing. I know that me personally, I'll go to different sites and go to checkout, and if there's something that's outside of my buyer profile that I'm purchasing, I will get a text message from my issuing bank confirming that this is me and doing this. It's one extra step in my process, but as a buyer, that makes me feel a little bit more secure about the merchant that I'm doing business with, and actually adds more credibility to the process, knowing that the merchant has these type of controls in place, as well as my issuing bank, right? So I think those are things to consider. Transparency and communication with the consumer. They really should have an easy way to interact with you. We started talking about, the disputes and the chargebacks, and they occur. It's important to understand that if the customer can't get in touch with you, that will probably remind them that this is somewhat of a negative customer experience. If they have a question they need to get in touch with you, this is where we want to make it as easy as possible to interact. That communication and how merchants handle that communication really are going to establish the relationship and that solid foundation that's going to keep that consumer coming back, because they know if they purchase something and they do have a question, they can get in touch. So these are things to continue to think about as you get into this checkout process and how you design it. I think the message I'm trying to get to is a little bit of friction is good as you provide that safety, that visibility, establish that trust. And then we start walking through, the post-checkout process and following up and keeping long-term relationships going. Communication, the safe feeling, opportunity to engage. I think you have to also balance your interaction. It can't be looked at, or at least come off to feel like it is more of a way for you to try to get them to come back and just purchase more. And I know it's a delicate balance to get to and how you're going to communicate with that customer, but the goal should really be focused on that positive experience, that you know your customer, that you're establishing that relationship. The communication's there if they want to. I think those are things to consider in that checkout process, right? So ways to follow up without seeming to bombard them with additional ads would be the delivery tracking, the purchase confirmation, receipts, any updates on their orders. I think that all solidifies, validates, and makes them feel, all right, great. This merchant's telling me my product's here. It's going to be arriving this point. And, if I have any issues, I can call them here. So just things to consider from a transaction lifestyle perspective. If these elements are not present in your customer checkout process, both from the start to the post, there could be a potential rocky downstream. And so things to think about, that if these aren't in place, or you do get feedback that your customers are claiming there is some type of a negative experience, these are things that are just a natural byproduct of this negative experience happening, or possibly some type of a negative ripple effect. And so you look at, from a customer point of view, I think we've talked through that, the frustration, negative experience, abandonment. Merchants, the outcome is the loss of revenue. You're losing these consumers not only now, but in the future. From an issuer point of view, I think it's important to understand that negative experience, as it potentially creates the disputes, is going to increase the operational costs, the call times for the issuers, that engagement that they're having where the consumer is now going to their bank and filing a dispute, which ultimately will come back to the merchant side of the house. Those disputes will have to run through the payment acquirer. Increased fraud levels will be increased risks on the merchant account. And then you have potential merchants that go into, maybe an excessive program, and their processing or their payment processing becomes questioned or put in jeopardy. So this all can stem from a negative checkout process or a bad customer experience, and that has the ripple effects on these four major entities that we're talking about, which kind of loops us back to that whole collaborative solution and why it is so critical to maintaining the success in this environment. So as we think about the solutions that kind of are in the market today and what's available, and some of the stats we saw from that Javelin study that I showed a couple slides ago, it's really important for these parties to be able to interact with each other. The merchants have a lot of information about their interactions with the consumer that maybe the issuers don't have. And so if you have a consumer that is bypassing a merchant and just going right to their bank and they're claiming one thing, when you, the merchant, have all of that interactions with them during your checkout process, if you could make that visible to the issuer, or at least put the issuer on the same page as you, that puts the issuer in a much more proactive position to question the consumer and not just blindly put through a dispute and process it. I think today, a lot of times, you're seeing chargebacks come through just because that visibility, that transparency doesn't exist, and it's not consistent across all the different silos that really make up the payment space or the payments industry. And so as you start thinking about how you can, create that customer experience and create it consistently, you want to consider these collaborative type solutions where you'd be out there working and saying, hey, we've interacted with the consumer like this. Here's what they've purchased from us. Here's the delivery confirm. Here's the shipping. Technology, as it continues to evolve, you're going to be able to track all kinds of different ways of the interactions between you and your customer. And if the issuing bank has the same type of visibility, I think it's on the same page, and then you're going to see less maybe friendly fraud disputes enter in where people are making false claims to an issuer, and they do that because they know the issuer doesn't have that visibility into those particular transactions, and they file the chargeback. And again, we go back to all of these operational costs that are going to hit all these four different silos. So I think that's where we're trying to get to in this whole beautiful friendship, the kids on the seesaw that you see there. It's really that balance, right? I think that's where we got to get to. And by making this type of data visible to all the parties and creating that consistent experience, I think that's where you get that balance, that collaborative effect, and everyone's on the same page. In the past, it's siloed entities. No one really understood all the interaction points that were happening, and chargebacks and disputes were one of the byproducts. And all four entities deal with that and experience it. In this collaboration, I think reduces quite a bit of that. The other thing to consider when you're looking at a collaborative solution and how to do it is one size doesn't fit all. As I talked about how each merchant is a little bit different, and you're going to have unique environments, experiences that you want to deliver. These are the things that make each merchant unique. You're also going to have to be able to use these collaborative solutions in a way that they fit your business. So, how data is shared by one merchant might not be the same for another. And I think that's really important because as merchants, one of the most valuable assets you have is your data that you're acquiring through that customer experience, that customer journey. And it's not as easy to just say, yeah, we're just going to share it with everybody, right? So I think it's important to understand that your data and what you're sharing makes sense for your organization. It's shared in a very secure environment, in a secure manner, and it's visible to only the entities that you want it visible to. These collaborative solutions are really going to have to make sure that one merchant might want to share data elements in an API, where another might want to share some type of static version of a digital receipt with key indicators. It's important to understand what works for your organization and how you can share it, and that there's collaborative solutions that allow you that flexibility to share it there, so you can deliver a customer experience that's unique to your organization. So as we kind of get into the last part of this webinar, and I think we're about 35 minutes past right now, right around there. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, but as the industry progresses and technology continues to progress, there's going to be more and more of a need for issuers, acquirers, and merchants to truly work together to deliver that experience. The customer experience that maybe happened 10 years ago in a silo, that's not going to be what's needed to keep up with what's happening in the payment space today. And if we continue to operate like that, we're just perpetuating the fact that it's still very easy for a consumer to purchase from a merchant and then go to an issuer, claim something that might not be entirely true, put a chargeback through, and now they've gotten the goods and services and didn't have to pay, right? And I think that's where the industry has heard what the voice, the feedback is from all these entities, and really keeps coming down to collaboration as a way to address this. Like anything, it's going to take some progression. It's not going to happen overnight. Obviously, some of the card brands like Visa and MasterCard have launched different solutions that help merchants. These take time. These take time for adoption across issuers and merchants to make sure that they're operating at full capacity and delivering the maximum value to all parties. But this is a great start. I'm excited to see where this industry goes and what happens from a collaborative effect as we move forward, and what's coming next, and how once these entities start working together, how there's going to be that brain share, that mind share on what else we can do together to truly help address some of these challenges. So I know this particular webinar has been focused really on consumer disputes, delivering a better customer journey, so on and so forth. But let's think about outside of disputes and what collaboration could potentially deliver in other areas of payments, and providing that measured visibility, transparency across that data elements or that interactions with the consumer, so that all the parties that are involved in the payments lifecycle truly have the same consistent visibility, right? And whether that's on the front end or the back end, I think it helps make a safer, more secure payments industry that allows merchants the flexibility to deliver their own unique customer experience, which creates that long-lasting consumer relationship where the customer continues to come back, for the foreseeable future, and interacting with the merchant in a very positive way. So, with that, I'd like to kind of wrap up and leave some time for questions. I did want to say that if we don't get a chance to get to all your questions, Laura's going to be kind enough to send them over to us. And if you'd like, we're happy to follow up with you individually and make sure that we're addressing any other questions that you have. But with that, I'd like to pause and hand it back to Laura and let me know if there's any questions that have come up during the webinar.
Hey there, Chris. Thank you so much. Before we get to the questions, I just have to share with you guys talking about how important it is that the merchant gets it right for the consumer experience. I'm just going to share with you something that happened to us here at Payments Ed. Just a little insight is the board, which the main thing we do is put on hopefully a fabulous conference once a year, which is coming up. But we also meet quarterly face-to-face, and the board and our advisory board, which Verifi is a part of, gets together and we sit down and we talk about, what's next and getting things right for all of our merchants, et cetera. And so we just choose different places in the US to try to, make it easy for people to get in and out. So we were at a hotel, large hotel, not a Marriott or a Hilton, but it was another large chain that you all, if I gave you the name, you would know it. But I'm not going to out them like that. But here's the thing. When we got our statement, our credit card statement, this is what the descriptor says from a large hotel chain. Capital C, so Charlie, Paul, Alpha, Lima. CPAL 180 LLC for several $1,000s because, the board meeting costs money. And I just thought, I want to call them and say, I bet you guys get a lot of disputes because I just looked at, because I see this several $1,000 transaction on my corporate card. I, freak out. Then I see the dates and the location, which happen to be in the same town we were. So this just goes to prove that you guys set yourself up by making sure the tiny things like descriptors are correct. This is something I would expect from a mom and pop shop, not from a large hotel retailer, right? That just, and this sets up lots of trouble for me calling the bank, trying to figure out what it is, or me then having to, as a consumer slash business, having to spend time. Frankly, I Googled it to see if any other people had been Googling it to figure out what the heck it was. But anyway, I just want to throw that out there when we're talking about, trying to do the best we can to mitigate risk and friction for the customer, because this has caused me grief, and I know I can't be the only one. Chris, you still there?
Yes. Sorry about that, Laura. Had to mute.
Yeah. So, guys, go make sure your descriptors are right. Like I said, this is a large merchant, and I would have expected significantly better than that. So, okay, now get off my soapbox and get to some of the questions. If I have to add authentication steps to reduce fraud, will this impact my shopping cart abandonment rate?
That's a really good question. I think I kind of touched on a high level of this early on. I can't definitively tell you if it's going to address or impact it negatively, but keep in mind, if it's something simple and it's a limited amount of friction, I think you're going to be okay. I think in the long run, the customer is going to feel, hey, this merchant really takes its security and my data security as a consumer is paramount to them. And so what you're doing is establishing, hey, this is a safer checkout process. There might be a little bit of a blip early on, and that could be something maybe you could help with some type of communication, as we talked about that transparency and that open communication with that consumer. If you prompt them at the right point that this is going to occur or this is part of your process, I think that's informed. And if it's just happening and it's out of the blue to the consumer and they don't truly understand why it's happening, I think that's where you're going to see maybe a higher level of cart abandonment. But as the consumer understands it's going to happen, I think for the most part, you're going to create a safer environment, more positive customer experience, and really establish that longer consumer relationship. These type of interaction points, that transparent authentication, are becoming more and more common, and so more widely acceptable, and consumers are becoming more experienced with it.
Yeah, I was thinking that's kind of a hard thing to answer, right? That question. So nicely two-stepped around. Can you give an example of what you mean by transparent authentication?
Absolutely. So this would be any type of text message or you'd call them. So you'd say, hey, something would pop up on the screen. This happened to me last week. I was purchasing something online and they needed to authenticate me or have a secondary step of authentication. And it said, would you like us to call you? Would you like us to text you or email? And so I think the quickest one, I click text. Right away, text me shows up. I put in that, they give me a code, a number, and I put that in and I'm on my way. So I think those are some of the more common examples of those type of secondary authentication.
What data do you recommend to include in a digital receipt to prevent disputes? Well, I'll get back on my high horse. If you're going to put some strange descriptor in my credit card statement, you should let me know that up front.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's going to differ by merchant, but we can talk through some of the examples, right? And as you get down to this digital receipt, that's where that collaboration takes effect. The example Laura gave is great because there is a level of descriptor confusion that had occurred right there. And if Laura calls her bank and the bank doesn't understand what that descriptor means, which they probably don't, that's where, if the bank and the merchant were participating in some type of these collaborative solutions, the bank would be able to request more information to help eliminate that descriptor confusion. So that could be something along the lines of the digital receipt pops up and it shows, hey, this is who the hotel chain is, this is where they're located, things like that, where it would help give a little bit more visibility into what type of transaction. If it was, like Laura said, a large amount on a transaction, maybe you've rented a conference room or a conference area, or there was an event that you had to purchase through that. Those type of details could be included in that type of a request. So as each merchant figures out what level of data you want to share, it's going to be really dependent on the vertical that you're in, the type of business, the type of product you're selling, and what would resonate with the consumer. What's going to remind, in the example Laura gave, what's going to remind her of what that charge is? And so as you do that, I think it's important to think about what's happening. If you're a digital delivery company or it's online music or something along those lines, it'd be helpful to put what the song is, when they interacted, maybe what device it was purchased from, right? If you're doing some type of device authentication or device ID, you can say this was, from this particular iPad or something along those lines, a tablet. So I think it comes down to what's going to resonate with that consumer to help jog their memory to explain, oh yes, that's what that transaction is. And that would prevent that dispute from moving forward. The other thing, as Laura mentioned, it's really you should look at your descriptor, and your marketing team knows a lot about what resonates with the consumer to get them in the door, to get them to come to your sites and start purchasing from you or use your solution. Maybe it's having consistent from the branding perspective with the marketing team to try to push that down to the descriptor. I know we only have 23, 24 characters, whatnot, but it's important to put as much of that in your descriptor so that the consumer sees it, and you can do as best a job you can as eliminating descriptor confusion from the onset.
So here's another good one. How will the introduction of strong customer authentication in Europe change the fraud methods for e-commerce? Will merchants have the same ability to affect the user experience?
Yeah, I think, with SCA in place, strong customer authentication, I think the customer experience really becomes more and more important. I know personally I hear from lots of merchants about this in those regions and what they can do, because they have to put the right balances in place, right? So they obviously need to perform SCA, but how do they do so without creating such an environment where it creates that frustration with the consumer, which leads to some of the items we talked about earlier in the webinar, like cart abandonment. I think that that becomes part of what's going on in the consumer and what's the easiest way to do it. So we mentioned some customer authentication. Obviously, there's rules and what are certain methods that are deemed acceptable for that, and it's important to understand what those are and how they work for your business. But this is not a set it and forget it type of situation, right? So as a merchant, there's got to be a little bit of trial and error, and make sure you're, reporting on or recording all the activity and what works best for you, so that you can tweak it in a way that it works best for your environment and your consumer. This isn't going to be something you're just going to say, all right, we're going to go this route, we're going to deploy it, and that's it. This is something that's going to take some time to really work through, not only finding the initial balance and what works, but how it's going to be maintained going forward.
Perfect. Here's a great question. Are you aware of any efforts to work with the merchants on best practices for root causes of UX issues that cause disputes and how to improve them, i.e. some sort of merchant coaching plan, etc.?
I'm not aware of an industry-wide initiative, but there's plenty of different avenues merchants can explore to increase education around root causes of disputes. I think, as I referenced earlier, and and how Payments Ed is such a big supporter of merchant-to-merchant communication, I think that's a great way. Get out there and talk to your peers and understand what others are doing. And it's really that cumulative learning effect that happens and takes place through that information sharing. There's organizations out there that can help you that specialize in these particular types of field to help you address how chargebacks are occurring, where you're vulnerable, why they're occurring. Sometimes it's just the customer experience might be off in one level and there's not enough visibility or communication, or your customers can't get in touch with you because they have a question, and it's something as simple as that, and they're saying, well, I can't get in touch with them, or it's taking too long, I have to hit too many buttons or press too many buttons to get to a person to talk to. I'm just going to go to my bank and I'm going to dispute the charge because I know it'll be done. Sometimes it's as simple as that. So I think those are things to take into account. But there's great amounts of knowledge out there, and there's a bunch of ways as a merchant you can learn more about it. Completely, from my perspective, I understand the merchant's core competency isn't going to be dispute management. But as a merchant that accepts payments, you're going to have to address disputes because at some level they're going to exist in your world.
So questions come in about VMPI to see if you can answer. Are you aware of like what percentage of merchants or large merchants versus small merchants that have signed up for VMPI?
Unfortunately, I don't have any statistics about adoption either on merchant, large, small, or issuer. My apologies. This is something that we would need to work with Visa on to get some additional visibility.
Great. Let's see what else have I got coming in. How do merchant-initiated transactions, recurring installment, no-show, additional charges fit into the data sharing system, i.e. grouping transactions together?
I guess I'm not understanding the question, Laura. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Person that submitted that, if you can give me a little more detail. What impact will the rollout of 3D Secure 2 have on fraud data, do you think?
I think 3D Secure is excellent form of authentication, and it's really a less intrusive form of consumer authentication as it was when it was originally launched. So I think there's high value there from a merchant where they can really tailor what that authentication from 3D Secure 2.0 is going to do for their organization and how they want to deploy it. So if you think about it, you're going to establish relationships with consumers, those ones that you've had interactions with 2, 3, 4 times that are a good customer might not need to authenticate. But if you get into the new customers, new markets, new campaigns that you're running, new ways to acquire business from marketing initiatives and marketing efforts, that's where you're going to want to deploy this customer authentication to really tell you, do you want to do business with this consumer, or do you need to get a little bit more information about this consumer, or what's a potential risk profile, right? We talked about buyer profiles. I think you want to understand a little bit more about that consumer before you progress into the payment, because that's going to give you an idea on the risk levels and what that potential risk is by transacting with the consumer.
Will PSD2's dynamic linking in Europe make merchants get their descriptor and their merchant name right?
Good question. I hope so. I
that would
apologize.
Be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think that's the goal. My apologies. I don't know if I can comment saying it will or it will not, but I think that's the
We
hope.
all hope so, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So guys, some of you have got some great questions. And again, I'd encourage you to visit us in San Francisco when we have the networks in fireside chats. So we hope to see you there in a couple of weeks. A couple more questions. Oh, this one's a little interesting. Kind of back to how do you win representments? What kind of data do you recommend capturing in order to win representments?
So that's going to vary by merchant and vertical, right? So if you, and I know there's long, but the card brands put out their representment rules, right? So the rules to build a representment are the same for every organization. And so based on the type of merchant that you are, there's in vertical and your merchant category code, there's going to be particular data elements that are going to be used for card brand and specific reason codes when building a representment. So I think it's important to understand A, where you fall in that category, and then B, what type of disputes or chargebacks your organization's receiving, and then figuring out what types of data elements are eligible to use when building that representment. Once you understand all of that, then it's important to understand, back to your customer experience, your checkout process, your consumer journey, what during your interaction with the consumer are you able to capture? What are you capturing today? And maybe what can you capture going forward, or what type of changes you could capture? Because all of that and how you put those data elements together per the card brand rules are really going to determine your success when you submit that representment. And are you going to win? Or are you going to lose? So I know it's a little bit of a long-winded answer to that question, but it's not a simple process saying, hey, just get these 10 pieces of information, put the representment together and submit it, and you're going to be good to go. There's going to be a little bit more granularity to that process.
And then how can I be proactive with my acquirer to contain fraud levels?
It's a good one. I think the first step is that if a merchant is being proactive, I think that's excellent right off the bat to look at fraud levels. So monitoring, reporting, understand what's happening. I think looking at the different channels of your business and what the potential fraud levels that are occurring there. As you're seeing different spikes, figure out the why behind it, right? And that's going to go with the reporting and how you're capturing things on your end as a merchant. Your acquirer is going to be able to work with you as you talk about the different fraud tools that will work best on the front end and what might be the most valuable for your organization. Your acquirer is going to have hopefully a lot of information and guidance as it relates to tools that are currently deployed. I think it's good to have an open dialogue, with the risk organizations at your acquirers. Understand some of the metrics that come through and the monitoring that comes through and what you can do to reduce those. So a lot of the acquirers will have a lot of the data, and they should be able to generate reporting, or at least help contribute to reporting that will allow you to continue to monitor these metrics and then figure out what is the right solution to deploy. Keeping in mind that what you deployed last year might be good, but 18 months from now, maybe there's something else you need to do, or do you need to upgrade that solution because the threats that are out there are going to continue to evolve. And just because you deploy a solution, last year, doesn't mean that that particular solution is addressing maybe new threats that are arising. So baseline is make sure you're in touch with your metrics and you're monitoring all the activity so that you can make a decision from a very informed position and find the right solutions that are going to most positively impact your organization.
Perfect. So Chris, I want to thank you so much for this information. I do have a couple of questions left, but they're really more focused on the Verifi products. And so for those of you on the line, I will send those over to Verifi and let them reach out to you directly. As you guys know, we at Payments Ed like to keep those educational and not sales focused. And so I appreciate everybody's interest and time. And Chris, appreciate all the good information and look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks in San Francisco.
Thanks so much, Laura. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for Payments Ed for putting this on, and can't wait to see everybody in 2 weeks in San Francisco.
Have a good rest of your day.